Hey guys, this video is for APUS. I hope you all watched the video yesterday. Remember, always watch these videos on your asynchronous days from start to finish. So hopefully you all did that. So we're gonna pick up where we left off on yesterday's video. The Spanish-American War had just ended. It was lasted 4 months. The United States won a pretty convincing victory against the Spanish. So what was left of the old Spanish Empire before the war started was basically in American hands now, or at least it was going to be up to the Americans to decide what we're going to do with all this new land. Because remember, America had been dabbling with the idea of imperialism throughout the 1880s and 1890s. So you could argue that's the reason we actually got in the war to begin with. But now we're faced with all this land, and the question became, what are we going to do with all this land? So the United States and the Spanish met in Paris. That was the place where treaties were always negotiated to end wars back during this time. And a treaty was signed, the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish-American War. But it ended the war, but it opened up so many other questions. When we have our live class tomorrow, I'm going to actually show you, on the computer, I'm going to show you like a map of like all this land that we got, so you can actually visualize it a little better. So in the Treaty of Paris, the United States acquired Puerto Rico, which became an American territory and is still an American territory 120 plus years later. The United States also acquired the island of Guam, which was a Spanish-owned island in the Pacific Ocean that is also still an American territory. And Spain had to recognize Cuban independence. Remember, we had beaten the Spanish in Cuba, and they had fought so hard for so long to make sure that the Cubans did not get their independence. But they were beaten in the Spanish-American War, so they had to recognize Cuban independence. The big question, though, was the Philippines. The Philippines was a large collection of islands in the Pacific Ocean. It had been a Spanish colony for over 350 years. We defeated the Spanish Navy towards the beginning of the Spanish-American War, pretty much ending 350 years plus of Spanish colonial rule. So the question became, now that the Spanish are out of the Philippines, what's going to happen to the Philippines? There were several options, for what to do with the Philippines. One was we could give them back to Spain. That was probably more of a theoretical option than a realistic option. We could share them with other nations. The United States could share them with other nations. That sort of arrangement actually was more common than you might believe during this time, where several large powers actually colonized an area together. So we could do that. We could give them their independence, which is which is the more moral option to take, especially when a lot of Filipinos helped the United States in the war against Spain with the understanding that they would get their independence, kind of in the way that the Cubans did. So that was an option, but a lot of Americans thought that was very problematic. Are the Philippines going to be able to stand up for themselves, against all these, larger nations that were kind of looking for colonies, the Brits, the Germans, the French, everybody else? Are they really going to be able to defend their independence? Are they modern enough? Do they have the infrastructure? Are they going to be able basically to thrive as an independent nation? So there are a lot of people who were just very skeptical of the idea that the Philippines could actually be independent. And some of them, it was just out. In fact, most of them probably, it was just out now. Well, I want them as an American. The Americans wanted the Philippines, so they did not want to give them independence, and perhaps were just looking for excuses not to give them their independence. One other possible option was to actually make the Philippines something called a protectorate. Now, a protectorate, the British did that in a lot of their colonies, but their colonies kind of, sort of. Basically, a protectorate is when the territory governs itself, but a larger nation is kind of responsible for that country's foreign policy, and their defense, and also is ultimately, in charge, even though the territory itself is technically self-governing. So we could have employed an arrangement like that, in the Philippines. Or the last option was just make the Philippines a territory of the United States, make it part of our country. Now, many prominent Americans, though, oppose the idea of actually making the Philippines a colony of the United States. Remember, we talked about in our live class the other day that the United States had a long tradition of anti-imperialism. There were a lot of Americans who were very skeptical, beyond skeptical, were outright opposed to the idea of the United States having colonies. That's just not the American way to have a colony. Now, there were very prominent Americans who opposed the idea of getting the Philippines. They actually formed their own group called the Anti-Imperialist League to oppose the idea of the United States getting the Philippines. And some very prominent Americans were members of this league. William Jennings Bryan, who was the famous populist leader, excuse me, which whom you might remember from last semester. Jane Addams, the mother of social work, the Settlement House leader. Andrew Carnegie was one of the richest men in America. Owned Carnegie Steel, was an anti-imperialist. Mark Twain, the most famous Mark Twain, who I love, my favorite writer, Mark Twain, who is the most prominent writer in America at this time, was also a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. So we had some very prominent people who opposed the idea of the United States getting the Philippines. How could a former colony then, like the United States, have colonies? That it was just fundamentally wrong, the idea of actually having colonies. There were some unions that actually, labor unions, that actually opposed the Philippines, the United States getting the Philippines, because they were worried that Filipino labor would actually compete with American workers and actually drive down wages. Many racists opposed getting the Philippines because, these are millions of people live in the Philippines. They're Asian people. And there were a lot of Americans who just didn't like the idea, particularly in the South, who didn't like the idea of actually taking responsibility for all these millions of people of color. But that doesn't mean that if you were for taking the Philippines, you were against racism. In fact, a lot of the arguments used by people who wanted to take the Philippines were quite racist. Basically, these people are uncivilized and barbaric and really can't take care of themselves. So it is really up to the United States to make sure that, we look after them. President McKinley very condescendingly called the Filipinos my little brown brothers. So the thing is that the Philippines also were totally an unknown quantity to a lot of Americans, and a lot of Americans knew absolutely nothing about the Philippines. There were a lot of business interests in the United States that were kind of eyeing the Philippines because they thought that because they're in a strategically important place, they're in Asia, not too far from China. The China market was actually a very or access to the China market was actually a very big goal of a lot of American business leaders during this time. So the Philippines might actually give us, a base to actually, have closer ties with China. So President McKinley had a really important decision to make. And he ultimately said that this is how he decided to have the United States take the Philippines. This is what President McKinley said about the Philippines. When next I realized that the Philippines had dropped into our laps, I confess I did not know what to do with them. I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance. And one night late, it came to me this way, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all. To educate the Filipinos, to uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace, do the very best we could by them, as our fellow men, for whom Christ also died. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. So maybe not surprisingly at all, the United States decided that we were going to take the Philippines. And in the Treaty of Paris, we took the Philippines and we paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines. Remember, that's very reminiscent of what we had done, during the Mexican War, when we actually, after we defeated the Mexicans in the war, we paid them $15 million. $15 million for the land that we took from them. So the United States now have the Philippines. It now belonged to us. But the thing is that the treaty, the empire, basically the appeal of empire was too strong, and we could not resist. And when the Treaty of Paris was actually put up for a vote in the United States Senate, it passed. But remember, a treaty needs 2/3 in order to pass, and it only passed by one more vote, one vote beyond the 2/3 that's required to pass a treaty. So it was a narrow ratification, but it was a ratification nonetheless. Now, what I want to talk about now is a topic that has really been ignored a lot in studies of American history. I don't remember learning anything about this. I learned about most of this on my own. But the United States fought a bloody guerrilla war against the Filipinos from 1899 until 1902, the Filipino-American War. Now, one of the reasons, in fact, the biggest reason that we don't learn, or we haven't traditionally learned a lot about this, is because it goes against the American narrative, right? The American narrative is that the United States does not take colonies. We do not fight wars of aggression, in order to conquer people. But the Filipino-American War was exactly that. It was a war that was waged by the United States against Filipino rebels who did not want to be part of the United States, and we were fighting to subdue them to make sure the Filipinos were a part of the United States. Now, the thing is, the war was absolutely brutal. Ultimately, 125,000 American soldiers served in the Philippines. The Philippines did not just say, okay, we're American now, we'll accept that. It was a bloody guerrilla war against the American occupiers, because for a lot of Filipinos, the Spaniards, who they hated, were just replaced by new conquerors. Were now replaced by the Americans. Now, the war, the tactics that were used in the war were absolutely brutal. Torture against people who we wanted to question or interrogate or punish. Concentration camps were actually used by Americans against the Filipinos. I have a whole bunch of pictures I'm going to actually show you, when we have our live class. Now, the Filipinos felt betrayed by the Americans, as you can imagine, who proceeded to basically subdue the natives through any means necessary. And it was unspeakable atrocities. The American military often burnt down villages, often looking for rebels, indiscriminate killing, something called the water cure, which basically, when you wanted information from someone, you poured water down their mouth and until their stomach could literally hold no more water, and then you asked them, for the information that the Americans wanted from them, and then if they still didn't answer, they pressed their stomach full force, all the water came out, and then they did it again. This is absolutely appalling, and this was a tactic that was used by the Americans against the Filipinos in order to subdue them. So in the name of civilization, you remember McKinley is saying we're taking the Philippines because we want to civilize them. But in the name of civilization, we wage relentless and barbaric fighting. The concentration camp policy, where basically we tried to put Filipinos into camps, away from areas that we wanted to subdue, where we felt they might be helping the rebels. The concentration camp policy is estimated to have killed 200,000 Filipinos who died of disease, of bad treatment, of malnutrition, of you name it. And this was a policy that was waged by the United States government against the people of the Philippines in their own country. So very interestingly, this idealistic attitude that we had toward the Cubans. Remember, we're fighting this war in order to make sure that Cuba was independent, and we gave them we facilitated their independence after the war. But this did not apply to the Philippines. which we were fighting this bloody guerrilla war in order to keep them a colony of the United States. Now, Americans did learn about a lot of these atrocities. Reports of the atrocities appeared in newspapers, but the U.S. military denied that anything untoward was going on, which was a complete lie. And opposition to the war the United States was building, even though a lot of the atrocities still were not fully known, because this just goes so against the way the United States sees itself, right? That we see ourselves as a nation that is about freedom and liberty and all those things, and then here we're doing quite the opposite in the Philippines. Now, the Americans argue that the Filipinos were barbaric, and that we have to do these things in order to subdue them and civilize them. One American general said, "We're going to have to kill half the Filipinos in order to civilize the other half." I don't know if he's saying that. I assume he is saying that ironically, but that is a chilling statement, right? That was also very revealing about what the United States mission was in the Philippines. Ultimately, the leader of the Filipino independence movement, Emilio Aguinaldo, was captured by the Americans in 1901. And once he was captured, the United States, the resistance to the United States pretty much slipped. So the war ended by 1902, but at a staggering human cost. 200,000 plus Filipinos were projected to have died in the Filipino-American War, and it was also about 15,000 Americans lost their lives fighting the Philippines in order to keep the Philippines a colony. It was a very, very dark episode in the United States history. So once the war was over, the Philippines officially became part of the United States. The United States actually appointed a governor general, who the president would appoint a governor general who would run the islands. The first governor general of the Philippines was William Howard Taft, who later became the president. And we wrote a new constitution for the Philippines, which we modeled on our own constitution, where there'd be a House of Representatives, a Senate, and we gave them a promise of eventual self-government. Even in time, we did that. But the thing is that it was a little bit vague about what that meant. When are the Philippines? When are they going to get their independence? I remember when I was a little boy, I was going through my grandfather's old stuff, and he had this old map, a map from the 1930s, and it said Philippines belongs to the United States. And I was really, really young, but even at that age, I was shocked. I was really young, so I guess you could say, how would he know about the Philippines being owned by the United States at one point? But I remember being shocked in this old map, seeing that the United States actually owned the Philippines. But we did. In 1934, we gave the Philippines a path to independence, saying that the United States would grant them independence in 12 years. Those intervening 12 years were a really rough one for the Philippines. The Japanese invaded, took over the Philippines, actually kicked the Americans out for a time. And then, and some of the worst atrocities of the Second World War actually happened in the Philippines, with the Japanese waging pretty brutal war against the Allies there. The Bataan Death March, for instance, actually happened in the Philippines. General MacArthur, one of the heroes of World War II, was kicked out of the Philippines and famously said, "I shall return," as he was leaving. Ultimately, the Philippines got their independence in 1946 and has been independent ever since. Even though the Philippines are, I would say, a pretty strong ally of the United States, and English is commonly spoken in the United States. Excuse me. Well, yeah, it is. English is commonly spoken in the Philippines today, which of course is a remnant of the United States control over the Philippines. But this was a very ugly episode in American history, and it definitely deserves a lot more attention. All right, guys. So we'll stop now. But remember, I want to split up the Spanish-American War into two lessons. When we have our live class, we're going to talk about some leftover business from the Spanish-American War. A lot of things we had to deal with, plus United States intervention and pretty much nonstop meddling in Latin America. Which kind of became like a persistent, which was a persistent theme of America, the United States, throughout the 20th century, and really began full force in the early 20th century under Teddy Roosevelt. So when we meet live, we will talk about that. All right, guys. So thanks for watching. Again, most videos in the future will be longer. I broke this into two because I really wanted you guys to to really soak in this episode. Spanish-American War, imperialism, Philippines, all of that. But videos in the future will be longer. So just a little bit of a warning. All right, guys. So I'll see you on Thursday for our live class. Also, I'll post on Google Classroom later today your homework assignment. Since you guys all have your book, so you can do your homework. All right. So until Thursday. Peace.